Hi, my name is Terry Sippel-Schmidt, and this is second video about CDS hooks. Previously, we've discussed the three different use cases in CDS hooks. The first being that of discovery, and what can a CDS service do and what data does it need? The second being the CDS services, which is really the heart of CDS hooks and clinical decision support, which is the synchronous workflow defined by the CDS hooks. And the third is the feedback use case and giving a response back to the CDS service about whether or not a particular recommendations were accepted or rejected. Let's go into a little bit more detail about each of these use cases before jumping into the standard itself. The first use case we discussed was discovery, and this is someone setting up the CDS service within the electronic healthcare record, and they're going to query the CDS service, usually it's one at a time, for what the CDS service can provide and what it needs. They're going to go ahead and put the words CDS-services onto the end of the endpoint for the CDS URL, and they will get back a response. That response is going to be an array of services as defined by the CDS hook standard. So that array of services is going to include, for each service provided by this particular server, it's going to include the hook which is it's going to trigger on. In this case, it's going to be patient view, and we'll go over all these hooks in just a minute. It's going to give the title of the CDS service. It's going to give a description about what the service is going to do. It's going to give an ID for the service, which, by the way, it can have an ID which handles many hooks, and conversely, one hook can trigger several different services with different IDs. So this is a many-to-many relationship. It's also going to have the prefetch information, which is, in this case, it's going to be a patient resource, and it's going to have a particular patient ID. So this is the simple set of information that goes back and forth. Typically, there's going to be a set of these, not just one single service. Before we jump into the second use case, let's talk about the data that we need for the second use case. So the second use case is the CDS synchronous workflow. There's three ways to provide data to the CDS service. The first is required. It's the context group. It's defined as part of the CDS hook standard, and it's basically who is the context about who's calling the service and who is the patient. We'll go into this in more detail. We will talk more about the CDS hook's prefetch. Prefetching data before calling a CDS service is optional, but you want to do it if you can. The reason for that is because it's all about performance, and prefetch will hopefully eliminate any additional queries, or at least reduce any additional queries, and that can be really critical for performance. The third is that the CDS service can do additional FHIR queries, and this can be really important, but keep in mind that it could also reduce performance. However, if you can get the data, it certainly beats typing it in. So the point of this being that remember that the CDS performance is critical, but you have to be able to access the data because that's essential. All right, over here on the left, this is the second use case. This is the CDS synchronous workflow. Over here on the left, you have the EHR. So you have a user, typically some sort of clinician and provider, and they're going to order a medication. They're going to invoke the CDS hook when they open up the particular screen on the EHR. They're going to invoke a CDS hook, which is going to call a remote CDS service. Now, this could be over the internet, remember, or it could be on premises, or a combination of the two even. The interesting thing is that CDS hooks defines synchronous workflow. So FHIR defined a synchronous transaction, which means that went from usually a client to a server and directly back to the client. In CDS workflow, we actually have a series of synchronous transactions. So you go from the EHR to the service, but we don't go immediately back to the EHR. At this point, we can have the CDS service go off and do additional FHIR queries. Now, here's what's really interesting, is that this other FHIR server, this could be a pathology server, this could be a genetics server, this could be an HIE, or Health Information Exchange, for a state at the state level, for example, the CRISPR in the state of Maryland. The reason this is important is that a lot of the time, information which is pushed back into the EHR can be compounded. You can take structured coded information like genetics, for example, and they're going to put this into a PDF. Once that PDF goes back into the EHR as the record on file, it is no longer queryable as structured and coded data. However, that structured encoded data may be sitting out here over in a different fire server and still accessible. So there may be a reason that it's worth the time hit or the time constraint to go out and query a different fire server. Another example is if that information isn't coming, or all information isn't coming from your local healthcare system, and you have to go out to a health information exchange into a different fire server. Those are all really great reasons to take that hit in performance and go look for the additional data. Then once the CDS service has found the additional data it needs, hopefully it has, it also needs an error to be able to error out if it can't. Once the CDS service has found that additional data, it's going to return what's called a CDS card. This card will be rendered and displayed by the client. So it is really returning JSON, and it is up to the client if and how and when to actually display that card to the user. There's different kinds of cards, 3 different kinds of cards to be specific, which could be displayed. One is an information card, the second is a suggestion card, and the third is a Smart on Fire app. An information card literally is information to display on the screen. A suggestion card, for example, could say, hey, order this study instead, or in this particular example, hey, switch to this medication. The only time that you want to actually launch a Smart on Fire app is if you want the user to interact with that app. So perhaps there's information that couldn't be found in any fire server. Perhaps there's information which is not stored as discrete information. For example, vital signs, believe it or not, are typically not stored as discrete information. They're often in flowcharts. So you may not be able to get all of the information. So that might be a reason to actually launch a Smite on Fire app. You may also need some clinical input that only the physician or the clinician knows. This is the basic workflow for the second use case. This is called synchronous workflow using CDS hooks. There's a third use case called feedback, which is very similar. Actually, it's just an extension of the second use case, where we're going to go back through, we're going to call the CDS service. It can go out and query for additional fire information if it likes. It's going to return the information back to the EHR and the clinical user. This time, however, it would also give a list of reasons which are optional for the clinician to choose. But if they so choose to do so, they can provide feedback, and it can be documented within the EHR automatically as to why a particular recommendation was not chosen. If they do that, that information can also be sent as feedback, structured feedback, back to the clinical decision support service so that this service itself or the algorithm can be tweaked as needed and they can learn and move forward. Those are the 3 use cases that are defined in CDS hooks. So it's not like fire where there's an infinite number of use cases. There's 3 primary use cases defined in CDS hooks. Now, on that note, I'm going to stop and we're going to take a look at the CDS specification itself. So you'll notice that I've gone to cds-hooks.hl7.org. So this is the official HL7 version of CDS hooks. You can see that this is version 2.01, also known as Standard Trial Implementation Use, version 2, release 2. As you can see, this is an implementation guide in the lovely colors specified by the FIRE implementation guides. Across the top here, we have the standard itself. We have the hook library, which we're going to jump into in just a minute. And we have the changelog. This is the changelog between versions. You don't need to know this. Don't worry about it. Here we have downloads where you can download some of the artifacts for CDS hooks. There's not as much here as in some of the other standards, but it is available if you'd like it. It's a node, it's an NPM download. Let's go back to the hooks library for just a second. So this is the CDS hooks library, and you can see that there really aren't very many CDS hooks which have been defined. You can see that these, by the way, these are all noun verbs, and it's all lowercase with a dash in the middle. So you can see that appointment book, encounter discharge, encounter start. Let's go down here. Order select, order sign, and patient view. Over here on the right-hand side, you have the maturity models, and we'll talk about those in a minute. They don't quite line up with the maturity models that are defined in FIRE, but it's the same idea. The maturity models in HL7 CDS hooks go from 1 to 7 instead of 0 to 5 plus normative like it is in FIRE. And you can see that 3 of these hooks, and I'll let you figure out, one is less mature, 6 is basically normative and will not change. But you can see that 3 of these hooks were prescribed in the 21st Century Cures Act, and you can see which ones have been implemented as a result and which ones have not. I will let you figure that out on your own. The other thing I'd like to point out on this particular web page is that anyone can propose new hooks. They would love for people to go through and propose new hooks. Here's the format that you put it in. Here's the documentation template that you use to submit it back to the CDS Hooks community. And then it would go through the entire CDS Hooks process. Now let's jump back to the standard itself. So you'll notice that there wasn't a whole lot of hooks. However, the ones that you did see were pretty general, so they can be used for a lot of different things. And also remember that it's perfectly fine for a CDS service to be called and to just go silent. So even though those hooks are fairly general, they can be called, and if the CDS algorithm does not apply, they can just go silent, and that is a perfectly fine result. All right, let's talk about what's in this implementation guide. We've got some intellectual property statements, which says it's all wide open. We have an overview. Conformance languages may and must and shall. Use of JSON. We're going to come back to this one in a minute. Here we talk about what defines a CDS hook and the anatomy of what is included in a CDS hook. Here you'll see we start into the use cases. We've got the first use case, which is discovery. We talked about that. It's a simple request and a simple response, but we'll go through it in more detail. Then we come into use case number 2, calling a CDS service. Now, I don't like the way that this is put in here. I would have put more indentation, but that's all right. This section is calling a CDS service. Here's requesting additional information using prefetch. Here's accessing a FHIR resource, which is the separate FHIR server. Here's the CDS service response, which is the cards and the attributes of a card, and linking, putting a link into a card, and requesting action, for example, creating an order in advance, which they can accept or not. So it's really calling additional information and the response. These 3 sections are really use case number 2. Then you can see here we have feedback, which is use case number 3. And down here we have some things about safety and security, extensions, data types, and some more information on hooks. Now, let's stop and go back to the top. Here, this was your overview. Use of JSON. You can read this section, but really what it says is if you want to use CDS hooks, you'll be using JSON. If you recall, FHIR, you can use JSON, XML, or another standard called Turtle. In CDS hooks, they say, yeah, the fact of the matter is when using HTTPS, most applications are using JSON anyway, so we're not going to bother with XML and Turtle. We're just going to define the use of JSON. CDS hooks we can come back to later. First use case, discovery. As I mentioned earlier in the diagram, it's as simple as doing HTTPS GET, going to the CDS server endpoint, and putting on the words CDS services. So this is very similar, analogous to the FHIR, getting a capability metadata statement and just putting the /metadata at the end of the FHIR URL, same idea. The response that you get back is defined here. You're going to get an array of services. The required information within that array is the hook, which it's going to be triggered on. It is recommended. I've never seen a title not returned. If you don't get a title returned, I would question the implementation. It's a very short title that you can put onto the screen. You also get a very short description. There's a limit on this description. I think it's 120 characters or 160 characters, something to that effect. But this is a very short description. You'll notice it's required. The ID, this is kind of the name of the CDS service itself within that CDS server. So here it's called an ID, but really it's a computable name for the CDS server. So this title appears for the human, this ID is for the computer. Prefetch data. So this is the CDS service saying, hey, I really need you to help me out when it comes to performance. Please give me all of the following data in advance so that I don't have to go and query for it because it'll save a lot of time. And then finally, this is called usage requirements, and I always think of it as notes to the IT people who are integrating this into an EHR for the things that they can be aware of and things that they could do to make the performance better. So that's it. It's not that hard. That's the entire discovery use case right there. Hopefully you're going to get a 200 response back. And down here is an example. You've got an array of services. So you've got your square bracket and JSON means it's an array. And we looked at this one already. Let's look at this one. So we've got an order select hook called an order echo clinical decision service support. I'm not sure. It's an interesting title. It simply echoes back the order which is being placed. That does not sound, I guess maybe it allows the provider to reread the title. Is a different form of confirmation. Okay, there's more complex CDS services out there than that one. Anyway, you can see how this provides an array, and within the different hooks, they have different IDs, but it could also have the same hook in a different ID, or conversely, the same ID in different hooks, because it's an end-to-end relationship. That was it. That was the entire first use case. Moving on to the second use case, calling a CDS service. So this is where it gets more interesting. This is the second use case. This is the first transaction of the second use case, which is the EHR calling a CDS service. So the EHR is the client, the CDS service is the server. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create an HTTP post. So unlike FHIR, we were doing HTTP gets, this is a post, and we're going to provide some information from the client to the server. That request is going to contain the following array of information. We have the hook, which is the CDS hook, which we looked at earlier, the name of the hook, for example, patient view or order select. We have the hook instance. This is a UUID. So this is a very long string of digits, which is globally unique. We have the FHIR server. Now, this is only going to be made available if the particular CDS service needs access to additional information accessed via FHIR queries. FHIR authorization. We're going to talk about this in more detail, but if you're going to give them a FHIR server, you have to give them authorization to get into that FHIR server. Context. This is required. This is very basic information about what is the specifics of the reason that this particular CDS service is being called. This might have information about the provider or the clinician and have some information about the patient. So this is a set of information going from the EHR to the service. This is prefetch. This is optional, you'll notice. This is a way for the CDS service to request additional information up front. So this goes to the performance side of things. This is prefetch object is defined by the CDS service. So as part of the discovery, use case number 1, when they were integrating the CDS service into the EHR, the CDS service told the EHR implementer what they would like as information being acquired beforehand, before that CDS service is called, under the assumption that the EHR can have access to that data much more efficiently and effectively than the CDS service can, which is usually true. So in the slides, we discussed the fact that there were 3 ways to give information to the CDS service. The first was context, which is required and basic. The second, which is prefetch, which is still fairly efficient and functional. And then the third was the FHIR authorization and the FHIR server. So you can see all 3 of those methods right here in the initial HTTP request, which is you've got the context, you've got the prefetch information, which is optional, and then you have the FHIR server information, just in case the CDS service really needs to go out and get more information. Now let's take a look at what that actually looks like in JSON. Here's the URL. We're going to do an HTTP post, and we'll go out to some URL. Here's our CDS-services again, and then this is the name of the CDS service itself, called the CDS ID, if you'll recall. Down here, we have the JSON object, which is going to be sent with the post. We've got the hook instance, which is our UUID. We are going to tell it what the FHIR server endpoint URL is. We're going to tell it what the CDS hook name is. In this case, it's patient view. There's only about 8 of them, right? We're going to give the CDS service information for FHIR authorization to go with this FHIR server up here. So the FHIR authorization includes an access token, which is some long string number. It's going to say what the type of token is, which is always going to be a bearer token. It's going to say it expires in, and this is in seconds. So this is a very short amount of time that the system has to go off and do its work. It's going to say what they can access within that fire server. Now you'll notice that they're going to be able to read the patient object and they're going to be able to read the observation instance, and that's all they're going to have access to. We still don't know who the patient is, but we're saying you can't have access to our entire fire server. You're only going to have access to one ID and these two objects. And then you're also saying what is the name of the particular CDS service that we're looking for at this URL. So this is the fire authorization for this fire server. This particular example has all three kinds of data. It has context, prefetch, and fire server and fire authorization. Let's go back to context. This is the most basic. User ID, who's using this particular CDS service at this time? Patient ID, this is the fire ID. This is the computable ID for this particular patient. It is not a medical record number. And then encounter ID. This is the computable ID or the fire ID for this particular encounter. So this is really basic information that we're giving to the CDS service, and all of this, I can't remember how much of this is required. We'll go take a look at that in a second. The other type of way to provide information in an efficient and effective way to the CDS service is through the prefetch object. So here you can see that we have this prefetch object, which was defined in advance by the CDS service. And it was asking for what is the type of the patient, the gender, the date of birth, the ID for that particular patient, and whether or not that patient chart is active. All of these things come out of the patient resource. So this is just an example of the object that you would send with a post from an EHR to a CDS service, which contains all three different types of ways to access data. All right, we're going to go down a little bit lower here in a prefetch template. So this is how the CDS service, as part of the discovery use case, is going to tell the EHR what the data is that it would like as part of prefetch. So here it's saying, I would like information out of an object, of an observation instance. For this particular patient, where my patient ID equals some fire ID, and the code equals this link code, which you should all recognize at this point probably as A1C value, I only want one A1C value. If this patient has 300 A1C values in their chart, I don't care. I only want one. And please sort them on descending order according to date. So in other words, give me the most recent one. So this will actually get resolved when this information is sent back from the EHR back to the CDS server. We're going to put that into a variable name called hemoglobin A1C. And that was how we'll send that information back to the CDS service. We're going to scroll down a bit here. The other thing that the prefetch will often request is information about the user, who's using the CDS service. So here's 4 typical prefetch tokens. You've got the practitioner ID. So this is the particular person who's the practitioner. You have the practitioner role. So you may not need to know who the exact person is, but you may want to know what their role is. Are they a nurse? Are they a physician? There's lots of different roles that are defined in HL7 Fire. You may want to know the patient ID. And then there's also the related person ID, but typically you're not going to see this one very often. Typically the ones you're going to see are these first 3. We're going to skip through here until we get to an example. We're going to skip this example. This one's better. All right, so here we have a context. We have an encounter ID of 456. They requested some information as part of prefetch. So we have draft orders, which we're responding as a bundle. We have medication requests. That medication request has an ID for this particular instance. The status is draft. The intent is order. And they need to know which type of drug we're ordering. So the system over here is RX norm. This is the coded value. In this particular case, this obviously is not for A1C because they're ordering amoxicillin. And they're ordering it for this particular patient. I'm going to keep scrolling down here. Here is an example of a prefetch template, and this is defined. This is only an example. This was defined by the CDS service, so you're never going to see this anywhere ever again because a specific CDS service made this request as part of the discovery use case. What they asked for was they said that we would like the patient demographics, meaning we would like the patient instance for the patient resource. We would like hemoglobin A1C as resolved by the particular query which they gave to us up here. We would like to know if the patient has an active condition of diabetes in their problem list. And we would like some information on the user of the CDS service. So how is this? This is what we would put into the note so that the person implementing this would understand. Here's how we actually put this into JSON. We've got a prefetch object, we have a patient, and this is going to resolve to the patient ID. We talked about this a little bit earlier about the hemoglobin A1C resolving to the observation for this particular LOINC code. Here we have the definition as defined by the CDS service for the diabetes type 2 being a condition for a patient using this patient ID with this code, which I have a feeling that if I went and looked it up, it would be diabetes, where the category is on the problem list and the status is equal to active. So they want to know if there's an active condition on the problem list. And the user is this particular role. So this is down here in JSON. Let's go take a look at this. So now, again, this is what the EHR would be sending to the CDS service to make things go more quickly and increase the performance. So here we have the prefetch. We have the patient. This would be the entire patient instance right here. Here we have the variable hemoglobin A1C as defined by the CDS service. It's a bundle. And we should only have one resource type of observation because that's what they requested with a count equal to 1. And here's the user. So this is the role of the user in this example of 1, 2, 3, which is somewhat illogical because it doesn't mean anything. But somewhere 1, 2, 3 would be defined as a nurse practitioner or something. But this is what would actually go across as part of the post from the EHR to the clinical decision support service. Now, we talked about another option for accessing data being that the CDS service can go off and query another FHIR server. However, obviously this is all HIPAA controlled and this is PHI, so we have to make sure that this is very tightly locked down. That's done using OAuth 2, and we're going to tell the CDS service what it's going to be able to do. So we're going to give it an access token, which is an OAuth 2 access token. We're going to tell it that it's a bearer type access token. We're going to give it expires in an integer value, which is in seconds, that the FHIR server will have to do its work. We're going to give it scopes. You don't get access to the entire FHIR server. You get access to a very few number of FHIR resources for a particular subject. The next thing is the subject. So we're not going to give the CDS server access to all of the different CDS algorithms it may have. This is for a particular CDS algorithm, for this particular scope, for this particular time, and sometimes it'll be even for this particular patient. So this is a way to lock down the information which is accessible to the CDS service to be very specific. As an example, here's the FHIR authorization object. You've got the access token, which is going to be some long, ugly string. Bearer type token expires in 300 seconds. The scopes are only that it can read the patient and it can read an observation, and only this particular CDS service can actually go and do that read. The responses that to the CDS service, so now we've switched gears a little bit, and we're sending the information from the CDS service back to the EHR. We can send two different codes. We can send a 200, well, there's more than that. There's other 400 codes which would apply, but two most common are a 200, which is okay, successful, or a 412, which means that the CDS service could not find all the information that it needed to execute, and therefore it failed out. Hopefully we got a 200, and as part of the HTTP response, so now this is going from the CDS service back to the EHR, there are two different arrays that we can have. One is an array of cards, and the other is an array of system actions, if it applies. So let's go down and take a look at the cards. Inside the array of cards, you're going to have a UUID for this particular call, for this particular prefetch and context information from this particular CDS service back to the EHR. So it's a globally unique identifier, which is very specific. You'll have a summary. It says less than 140 characters. Typically, it's going to be even less than that because they're going to want to display it on the EHR. Sometimes there'll be a little, like you'll see a little I with a dot or, view for more details. Sometimes this detail array string will be filled out and it's optional, but it'll give you more information about what the CDS service was actually doing. The indicator flag is required, and it's one of 3 possible values. It indicates urgency and importance, and it has to have a value of either information or info, warning, or critical. It often won't be displayed this way. Often it'll be green, yellow, or red, or some other color coding combination as defined by the healthcare system, because remember, this is what comes across as JSON, but this does not mean that this is how it gets displayed to the end user. So hopefully that's something consistent within the healthcare system. The source is required, which is we're going to tell the user where this information is coming from. Suggestions. All right, we have suggestions, selection behavior, override reasons, and links. Let's talk about each of these separately. Suggestions. This is the way in a card to say, we suggest this order instead of this order. So this is going to be an array of possible suggestions typically. There's ways to say, we'll take a look at this in a minute, but there's a ways to say within this suggestions which one is preferred. There is override reasons. Now we'll get into this in more detail in use case number 3, which is the feedback loop. But if feedback is going to be implemented and if the CDS is going to be overridden, we may want to give them override reasons so that the CDS service can learn from the behavior of the physicians. And then finally, links. Links are pretty common. Links are an array which often goes to information to say, we're going to tell you this, but if you want to read more detail, go read this particular journal article, or go look at this CDC website, or go look at this particular guidance. And so a link is usually a way to say, we have some information for you. But if you would like more information and know where this actually came from, go click on this link. Okay, the first of these that we're going to go take a look at in more detail is source. So I mentioned earlier that the source is where this guidance came from. So let's go take a look. This is actually an object. You can see right here. This is actually an object. So let's go take a look and see what all the information that we're going to tell the users about where the source came from. Label. This is kind of like a title. It's a human readable short label for defining the source. URL. If this goes back to a click or goes back to a link, you can define that link right here. Icon can be really helpful because rather than saying CDC, maybe they'll put the CDC icon up and it's just something that just registers much more quickly. The topic is optional. It's a code, and it goes through and defines the different ways to categorize the sources of information so that you can search on them and filter things. All right, to scoot back up here for just a second. The second type of card attribute that we discussed in this table up here is a suggestion card. So let's go take a look at a suggestion card. A suggestion card can include an action, and so we're going to talk about these two grouped together. So first of all, in an action card, you have a label. A label is a human readable string. You're going to have a UUID. We already discussed that. You're going to have is recommended. So this is an optional field, but if you're going to return multiple suggestions, you're probably going to want to say which of the suggestions is the most highly recommended and not just leave it wide open. You can also have an array of actions. This is also optional, and we're going to jump right down to here. Okay, so what is the type of action? This is an array. So each of those are going to have these 4 fields. What is the type of action? This is required. It has to be one of the following values. It's a create, it's an update, or a delete. So perhaps you are suggesting that they change an order. Perhaps you're going to want to delete the existing order, and then you're going to create a new order, or maybe you update the order. But those are the 3 values, the 3 actions that you can take: create, update, and delete. You're going to have a human readable string, which is the description. This is conditional. It's a resource. It's a FHIR resource. So if you're going to do a create, you have to tell them which type of FHIR resource you're going to create. And again, we've talked about this earlier, but if you're going to do a delete, we're hoping that you do a deprecated instead of a deletion. And then we have resource ID. A resource ID is typically used for a delete, and so it's related to any information which this is replacing. So let's take a quick look at a create action. Here we've got the type as an action. We've got a name for it. We're going to create a medication request, and we're going to create an ID. Typically, this is not what an ID is going to look like because it's going to be a fire ID, and then it's going to have the rest of the medication resource in here that we're requesting. Okay, so if I go back up to my card attributes, one of the other arrays that we have defined in here is override reasons array. So let's go take a look at that next. And then after that, it'll be links. And that's the other type of array that's defined in a card object. Apologies for the scrolling. So this is the override reasons array. And this is an array of codes. And this is important because if this is going to be computable, you can't just have a free text string. So they're going to give an array of different types of codes. Now, these codes are in fact defined by the CDS service itself, but it would be great, and I think they even have a comment in here. Implementers are encouraged to submit suggestions for standardizations. So right now, these are defined by the CDS services themselves, but it's a goal of CDS hooks to get to the point where the override reasons are actually also implemented. For example, contraindicated, that's got to be something that should be as part of HL7 fire. So this is the display that, for example, patient refused or contraindicated. This is the word that the physician or clinician would actually be clicking on. This is the code that would get sent back to the CDS service. Okay, so the last object, which is defined in the cards object, is the link object. So let's go take a look at that next. We have a label, which is the human readable string. We have the URL, which obviously is required as part of a link. We have the type of URL, which is also required. There's two options for types of URL. The first is absolute, which means just go straight to this URL. The second is that it's SMART, or Smart on Fire application launch URL. And so that's going to have to be launched a little bit differently, including some of the security. This absolute, maybe this just goes to a CDC website or a state health department website. The Smart on Fire URL is going to have to be given some auth to authorization. So then we get down into the app context optional string. And here's where we're going to give some of the Smart on Fire launch parameters. We'll get into that in more detail later. And then finally, we have the auto launchable option. And this basically means, does somebody actually have to click on that link, or is it just going to automatically auto launch? I'm going to let you go through these examples by yourself. JSON examples from the object definitions above. Here we have the third and final use case. It's called the feedback use case. Now this is going to be a post from the EHR back to the CDS service, and it's going to contain a feedback array. Here you can see the URL that we're going to use. It's going to go to the URL of the CDS services. Here we have the CDS services. We have the ID for the CDS service / feedback. It's going to contain, that post is going to contain a JSON object. That object is going to be an array called feedback. That array is going to contain the following items. It's going to contain the card, which is the UUID, so that we know which feedback this is from. It's going to contain the outcome. The outcome will be one of two values, accepted or overridden. It'll have accepted suggestions. If there are multiple suggestions, it'll identify which of the suggestions was accepted. It could have override reasons, which we just discussed about. If it's one of the override reasons, this is actually a code which goes back to the CDS service. And then it'll have an outcome timestamp, which is just basically when did the user actually make the selection. Here's an example of a suggestion which was accepted. We have an array called feedback. Here's the card instance UID. The outcome was accepted, which is one of the two text options that they can return. The accepted suggestion, this is an ID for that particular suggestion, because remember, suggestions can be an array. And then outcome timestamp is just the time, date, and timestamp of when the user actually selected that suggestion. All right. I'm going to let you go through and read the rest of these examples. And in a separate video, we're going to talk more about safety and security in launching smart on fire applications. Next up is video 3.